for almost all of us, we're in this moment where it's become so cheap to approach us with communications, whether it's I'm on a website and suddenly the platform wants me to do something that I didn't go there for, or it's incoming spam in any messaging that you can think of. For many of the folks I talk to, certainly for me, there's this sense that I'm always being sort of asked for something. It's almost that feeling. If you've ever been to a tourist place where you were constantly being pitched by people walking by wanting to sell you something, I feel as if digital life and much of modern work life has become a version of that. And it was one of my own students who really framed that, saying it's just so awful being the feeling that you're being hawked something all the time, and it's not necessarily the thing you want. And what I'm curious about, David, Garrison, you're someone who's always approached conversations instead looking for what will surprise us. And it's such a 180-degree difference from you want something from me to what might we surprise each other with. I'm just wondering for you two, do you feel that difference? How does that difference feel to you?
I think one thing that strikes me is Alejandro, that your intro kind of assumes the perspective of the person being hawked, right? But you're talking about it as though the thing that is defining that interaction is the person who's hawking, right?
Huh.
But I think one of the powerful things about getting away from just transactional thinking is the creative capacity to just flip perspectives. So to say, like, part of what your student is probably bugged about is the implication that they should also be hawking all the time, right? And that there's pressure in that. And if you think about not just the fact that you're walking down the street and feel like anybody you talk to is trying to pitch you something, but also that anytime you talk to someone, you should be trying to pitch them, that creates this weird internal dialogue with yourself about like not being good enough because you're not selling something. I think what's so powerful about that ability to shift lenses as a skill that we can build by practicing is that it taps into the emotional capacity of an interaction to change how we think about ourselves, about why we do things, about the other person, right? It just expands. And, I talk a lot about stories and narrative, but plot lines, we often are closing plot lines. And part of the power of not being transactional all the time, it's not that transaction is bad, but the power of not kind of forcing transaction is that it opens plot lines.
You bring up a point about sort of why things are being framed in this way. And certainly in the early digital age, I think for many people, there was this sense of possibility that we could connect on our own terms with others, and who knows what was going to happen. And it's a big theme in Mims and my book, One Size Fits None, that more and more now, if I'm using any platform, it's sort of pre-designed and not even to try to understand my situation and where there should be an automation of the meaning of my need according to certain standardized situations. Healthcare is one where, have you had this experience? More and more, the experience of a doctor that takes time and tries to understand your situation more broadly can seem rare, because so many doctors are on these strict sets of rules where they have to see this many patients and they have to achieve these outcomes. So, which is another huge theme. There's a home health aide who is what I would call a genius home health aide, who was working with my family. Genius because she would basically redesign the user experience of a space to make a recovery better. And I'll never forget the last day she worked with us before some older relatives were about to go be with their grandkids. And she sat three generations of us down, 1, 2, 3. And she said, I want to talk to you all. And I thought we were in trouble with her or something. But what she ended up saying, she said, I've been doing this for decades. And I felt more appreciated for who I am and how I might creatively solve these problems. This is actually the nicest thing someone said to me in years. She said, this family listens to me and appreciates me. And I had to like not cry because it was a very difficult situation. But I was like, wait a minute, even in something that seems inherently transactional, a home health aid situation, no, not at all.
Yeah, it's funny actually you bring up the healthcare thing. I had a conversation yesterday with someone who's doing work in healthcare AI at scale, at the kind of like big system level. And we got into this really interesting conversation about how often in these highly transactional marketplaces, kind of sectors like healthcare, where you are measured on your ability to see lots of people and you charge based on your time. These technological advances are incredible. We can do things now that are amazing. And yet, in the middle of that, we start to think that everybody should do this, right? And that becomes the language. It is about like, how do we get everybody to do this, right? And so the technology becomes the center. And the real question for me is, how do we transform so that in a way that we don't lose sight of the reason we are embracing these technologies, which is the humanity. And so, and now we're getting into Connect and stuff, but like I talk about it often. Our principles of developing Connect are around what I call this philosophy of humanistic minimalism. And the and there's two parts to that on purpose. The first is that it has to focus on the thing that matters, which is the connection between two people. That conversation is the thing that people want. That's what they're showing up for. That's what they will remember. I am not building a system that people are going to remember because of the system. I want I want the system to fade away so that all that is left is an easier conversation that feels so natural to people and that inspires them to act, right, in ways that are at scale, and not at the scale of like the 10 people that you or I can introduce each other to over the next week, but like scales of tens of thousands of people. How do we create meaningful conversations through the idea that we are actually focusing on the people having the conversations and always going back to how do we get more of that? The second piece is the minimalism, which is to say, most of the time, technology companies, they are trying to engage you more and more and more, right? And so we build systems, and we've all heard this conversation, that are addictive, right? And they do it in different ways. And that makes sense because you're trying to sell something. And you're trying to get people to spend more and more time on your systems. What I'm interested in doing is actually having people spend less and less time interacting with our system and having it be more and more time interacting with each other. So the humanistic minimalism is kind of what you're talking about, and it comes up in all sorts of settings, and it is particularly important in settings like healthcare, where the incentive and the kind of momentum is always towards improved efficiency, not necessarily towards remembering the human.
So I love it. So there's one quick piece I want to say in response to David's last comment and something Alejandro said, and then I want to get into the formal intro of who David is. He's given us some of the cool mechanics of what he does, but I want to help people put a name to it so they know where to go and look it up later.
He's this guy that just joined our conversation. It's nice.
Okay, but what I was going to say to David's point and Alejandro's point, you're right about the efficiency of healthcare with one exception, which is the concierge model, which is that if you're willing to pay a lot of money for doctors to spend a lot of time with you, you can do this. And a friend of mine was approached by someone to join the concierge practice for $100,000. Like, and then there's money on top. Like, it's a lot of money for people. So it's something that Alejandro and I also kind of hint at in the book, is that if you have the money, you can afford to pay your way out of this minimalist experience. We call it life and cattle class in the book, but that's basically what you're talking about. Of like, if you want your doctor to spend more than 7 minutes with you, you better pony up.
Totally.
Okay, dark, but we'll come back to that. But it feels kind of on brand for the podcast. We went somewhere dark, and then we'll pull it back. But what I wanted to do as we transition into the rest of the conversation with David is just give folks a more formal introduction to who he is. So he is the CEO of Connect Networks, and as he's talked about, it's a networking platform that's trying to create meaningful connections among lots of people through this art and science of connection, because it is both an art and a science. There's a math, and then there's this non-math piece, and they're both really important, as David will talk about. In addition to that, he's founded Climate and Capital Media, which is a nonprofit organization focused on the business of climate change, and he leads Climate and Capital Connect, which is kind of a bridge between Climate and Capital Media and the Connect Networks offering, which is basically a Match.com meets LinkedIn for sustainability. It's focusing on global professionals, people who care about having an impact and sustainability. So that's the broad strokes. So for folks who are going to look up David's organization after this podcast, it's Connect Networks. That's where you'll be able to find information about what he does. And then I guess let's get into it.
Thanks.
I'm Alejandro Juárez Crawford. My co-host is Mim Plavin-Masterman. And we're on a mission to make experiments of your own as normal as watching videos on your phone. Welcome to What If Instead, the podcast. David, a moment ago you said two things I want to pick up on. One was this beautiful statement that you want the system to fade away and to make it about the conversation. You had a more eloquent way of saying the second half of that. And you made me think of older pre-digital forums, a bazaar, a theater, a cafe, which were conducive to cool things happening, conversations, commerce, theater. And the great ones often would fade into the background. And it's not that if you were at the theater in Bayreuth, or which is very carefully designed for certain kinds of opera, or the Cameralta in Izmir, which is a legendary market. It's not as if those didn't become institutions, but they were institutions because of the space they created for lots of little things to happen. And so I'd be so curious for you to pick up on this idea of the system fading away and tell me if I'm wrong, but is that an old idea, and how do we apply it to the age of micro-targeting and digital platforms?
I mean, I think you're touching on a really important point. A lot of what we're doing with Connect is actually not new. It's not, we are reverting back to things that we've known how to do forever. And actually, right now, there's nothing in Connect that we can't do on our own. It's just that we don't. And there are lots of reasons we don't, and we can get into those. But just like you're saying, those old forums were incredibly powerful for a lot of people, right? And, there's been a decline in people's, an increase in people's sense of loneliness and lack of connection. But I would say that, the thing about all these older forums and the current ones where people know to go for inspiration, like a summit or a conference, right? You go there and you come away with like, oh my God, I met 40 people in the hallway. They were incredible. I've got all their business cards. I'm going to talk to them all and we're going to do incredible things, right? And then, 2 months later, how many have you talked to? 2. And yet you've got to wait until the next conference next year to do the same thing again. Like the problem with, one of the problems that we're trying to solve for is the bias that creeps into who we meet and who we have conversations with. And so you're totally right. Those old forums and conferences today are incredible. I think they do, there are a lot of really good experience-driven conferences and stuff that you can go to. The problem is that who shows up determines who you get to meet. Mm-hmm. Who is, quote unquote, approachable determines who you talk to, right? Yep. Mm-hmm. Who is already in a conversation matters, right? So like And what you kind of have time to just throw in and see what sticks in a conversation in the hallway ends up meaning a lot, determining a lot. And we frankly don't get that much practice at being curious in a way that lets us network into these wonderful serendipitous moments, right? And so that's the thing I think that's different about what we're trying to do. And the reason I talk about fading away is because for a lot of people, for extroverts, that's fine. You're good at doing that. You could do that all day, right? But for an introvert, like, the conversation is great. People love one-to-one conversations that are meaningful. What they don't love is all the stuff that goes into getting to it. And so you show up at one of those forums in Gertrude Stein's apartment in Paris, it's incredible. But getting there took a lot of work, right? And if you're not built for that, that sucks.
I don't know if you guys have ever read the book Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam.
Yeah.
But it feels very much sort of like a companion piece to what you're talking about, of the bowling league. It wasn't really about the bowling. It was about the community around the bowling and the people that you met every week when you left your house to go bowl in this bowling league. And it feels like there's this sort of digital version of the you're in your space texting with someone. That's a kind of a connection, but it's not the real connection that we want. And so it sounds like what you're trying to do is create spaces for those unexpected connections to form, which is what happened at a bowling alley. Like, you get up to go get your bowling shoes and you run into someone, or you are doing something, you're getting a drink and you meet someone from a different team and you have a conversation that maybe becomes relevant in 4, 5, 6 months or something.
When you are introducing people, and there are good ways to introduce people to each other, right? When you are introducing people, you always need something for them to fall back on in the conversation, right? So that, we can fill 5-10 minutes just talking about who we are. Totally fine, right? But we get to the end of that 10 minutes, what do we talk about, right?
Right.
And so that's why networks, when you're creating them, they need something that is concrete enough and meaningful enough that people will fall back onto it and appreciate the other person's perspective on that thing. So, the bowling piece is exactly that. You show up and you may or may not get into this deep conversation with the person,
right?
But you will always be able to go back to saying, "Oh, we got a strike,"
right.
That's it.
Right.
So that piece of what you're saying is super important, and I think often gets overlooked in favor of talking about like how you're matching people.
What are the things that you look for or ask people to talk about when you're having them fill out some sort of a questionnaire that says, okay, these are some things we can match people on?
So why don't I step back for a second, because we're going to get into like all of these questions, and people still won't know what we do. So, so Connect.
David fights crime at night. Go ahead.
That is not one of my skills. So Connect is this idea that we have. It's a platform that is trying to introduce people for meaningful one-to-one conversations, not at the scale of the 10 people that we can introduce each other to over the next week if we try hard, but tens of and hundreds of thousands of people at once. What are the things we can figure out that imbue meaning into conversations before, during, and after they happen? And that's the thing that we're trying to figure out. And like you suggested, like there's a lot in there that we do know. There's a lot in there that we have hypotheses about, and there's a boatload that we don't know.
Right.
And that's part of what I'm so excited about this for, is that it is an entirely new set of data that we are going to have, and we can talk about why that's exciting.
For sure.
So the way this works. So when you become, it's super simple in concept. It gets complicated on the back end, but in concept, there's really only like 5 steps in the whole product. So step 1, you become a member, you're vetted, you come into the system, and you fill out a profile. And that profile can vary depending on the network, because each network has different goals and different criteria for matching, and we can get into kind of how we do that. But that step one is just kind of basically like teeing up whether you were allowed into the network, who gave you who credentialed you, and what are the kinds of things that you want to tell us about yourself. The second, then, once you have your profile, then every 2 weeks you get a note from the system that says, "Hey, Mim, would you like to participate in what we call a match round?" And you don't have to participate. It's built for busy schedules. And so some people, like, they participate twice a year, meet a couple new people. It's kind of cool. Great. That's it. Other people match literally every round. And so we've been running it for 3 years now-ish. And, we had our first person top out over, I think they're now at 77 matches. I mean, that's a lot of matching. People really get into it. And there's some cool things that come out of that. For example, we noticed that people who, by the time they reach 20 matches, the language they use to describe why they're matching has changed from when they first joined. But so
wait, how does that language change? Can you open that up for a sec?
Sure.
For example.
So, often what happens is people come in with this kind of transactional mindset where they're like, I want to meet people who do X, right? Because I am trying to sell Y. And that's who I would like you to introduce me to. Thank you very much. I want you to increase the funnel, right? And I want you to put qualified leads in my funnel. That's great. Thanks very much. Great. By the time they get to 20, and there are thresholds that get passed along the way that shift, but by the time they reach 20, most people are starting to look they're exhibiting what we call the culture of curious generosity, where the combination of being curious and generous, like generous in your curiosity and curious in how you are generous, that comes through in how people talk about, for example, that what they're really interested in from the network is getting insight into things, in how other people see the space that they're in, right? Or that they're interested in opening up new networks that they didn't know, that they didn't have access to, right? And the simplest version of that is obviously, like, if I'm a librarian in, Mid-Coast Maine, then I probably don't know an awful lot of librarians in Senegal, right? That's an obvious that's an obvious network to open up, but there are lots of other flavors of networks that define it that you can open up. So I don't know whether that kind of answers the question, but that's kind of, we see shifts in conversation about, and part of the reason for that is, the first couple matches that someone does coming in when they're transactional are generally kind of closer to home, of the system tries to match them closer to home, of like people that you would expect to meet, right? And as you go on, it kind of pushes you further and further outside your comfort zone. And there's some awesome research that we can get into around culinary research, actually, that speaks to why this works. But by the time they get to like 3 matches, 1 match in, they meet someone that they expect to meet. 2 matches, they meet someone who is, maybe a little bit different, but they can see the pattern. 3 matches, by the time they get 4, they're starting to see, hey, these people are different. And I liked my conversations with all of them, but I didn't get the same thing out of them. And then they get to the 5th one and they start to get curious, and they're like, well, what are you doing? And 6, 7, 8, they're like, oh, hey, I was talking to this other person and they were doing X. It sounds kind of like you're doing Y, right?
Yeah.
And then by the time you get to 20, they're like, oh, this is cool. Like, now I'm actually curious about what this person's doing, right? So, but it takes that long and that much practice to build that muscle. So
go on, continue.
So that's, now we're at the point where you are telling the system, hey, it's a match round every 2 weeks. I would like to participate, right?
Yeah.
And so you tell the system when you want to meet with someone. And that is an important piece in there about control, not kind of giving up your calendar to the system, but telling it when you want to meet. And you can see each one of these steps. This is the art and science of it, Mim. Like, the obvious answer is like, we have a tool called Calendly or Google Calendar or whatever. Like, you can give me your calendar access. I could ask you for that. But there's something about you telling me when you want to meet someone that's a really important nuance in there.
Right.
Each of these steps has stuff like that baked in.
I love that.
So then you tell the system when you want to meet someone, and the system goes away and it thinks about who you're going to have a great conversation with. And it comes back and it puts a meeting on your calendar for the time you've both said you're free, and it introduces you. And the only thing you have to do is click on a link that shows up on a conversation like this, except for there's only 2 of us, not 3. Go ahead.
I want to pause for a second, the steps of how it works, because I think there's this delight you're achieving that I don't want folks to lose sight of as they're losing this. So, David, there's more to the process that we want to hear about, but there's a few things that really struck me as you spoke. And there's a concept called serendipity surface area from Professor Anthony at Tuck that we actually quote in One Size Fits None. And the first thing is that the mechanics that you're describing are important, but what I'm hearing is that what you're giving us is to expand our serendipity surface area. And let me take a second and speak as someone who's a happy repeat subscriber to one of these networks. And I'm going to speak not in transactional terms, right? This is not about selling network, but in terms of what that's done for me. And let's take 2 examples of people. One is Katie Osborne, who does these trashy markets in Chicago. It's circular economy stuff. And then Larry Koffler, who is does incredible work in communications and beyond. And these are people that I connected with through using a Connect network. And what's amazing is the serendipity surface area there. So I just would never have run across Katie. There's no reason I would have. And since meeting her, and in very much the way you talked about, where there's this, wow, we think alike, even though what we were doing wasn't in common at all. And then I've since introduced her to folks, and it was this incredible thing where this crazy thing that she was doing of basically working with artisans to create these trashy markets and do circular economies in Chicago suddenly became a part of my world. So I want to call that, just for fun, the wrinkle in time, right? Remember the kids' book where there's a dress that an ant's walking across, and if you fold the dress, you folded the dress for me. Right. And I'm the ant. So suddenly I'm connecting with Katie in Chicago. I just wouldn't have run across her. Whereas Larry is almost the opposite kind of connection, where Larry lives a few blocks from me. Turns out randomly Mim knows his cousin.
Yeah, it's so random.
There's just, more in the same.
His cousin's kid went to school with my kids. Like, it's very
awesome.
Like we compare notes on which bagel shop closed and how much we mourned it. This kind of person, right? In that we have so much neighborhood in common. And yet Larry I met because you had me do a talk with Sebastian Gros for the network, one of these things. And the model, it's not a normal talk, so we may want to get into that. But Larry went to it and reached out afterwards. He is since someone who's gone so deep that he read early drafts of our book and give us feedback, and is busy working on audiences that would be interested. And what's cool about that is that he might have been in my neighborhood, but there was just, unless it was a random introduction, I wasn't going to meet Larry. So I feel as if you're doing this wrinkle in time thing and expanding our serendipity surface area. And I want to think more about that. But if you could pull the lens camera back a little from the details of the process, and why is it that I'm able to have those experiences that I otherwise wouldn't? What's the aha there that folks listening could understand?
Mim, you were going to add something?
Well, I guess I was going to ask, and it's a kind of a related question of, once you meet enough people, it turns out a lot of people in common, or there's a sort of a network math of it, of the next person you meet, turns out you already know other people in common. And it seems like that could be something that's happening. But to Alejandro's point, what is that aha moment that is happening within the network? I hate to call it special sauce, but what is it? Yeah. I guess what makes it different from I'm trying to, I guess I'm trying to articulate it in this way of like, if you're introducing people to folks they would have never met otherwise, and there's something happening in that transaction that makes people more curious, how did you know that would happen, or how did you hypothesize that that would happen, that just by meeting people outside of who you think you should meet, it turns that part of your brain on versus forces people to retreat more into what they do know?
Okay. So there's a lot to unpack there. And I don't think there's the problem is that there's not one answer.
Okay.
But I'll frame a couple things that I think are relevant to what you're asking. So in general, at a high level, what I tend to think about Connect as is, normally when we network, we're trying to find people who make sense for us to know, right? And
Right.
and that makes sense piece of that sentence is the defining factor there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what that ends up doing is we know how to meet certain types of people. And this is the challenge of transactionalism, is we get in a rut because we build a muscle that is very good at knowing certain types of people. So if I am a salesperson in a certain area, I know how to find the people who I am likely to sell to, and I can do that over and over and over again. And if I'm a children's book librarian, I'm probably pretty good at finding other children's book librarians, right? That's
right.
Yeah.
But those actually turn out not to be the most interesting conversations. The conversations that are most interesting are when that children's librarian meets the gallery curator for children's art, when they meet the person who is in the marketing or the product development team for Scholastic, right? Those are the ones where it's not comfortable, but you walk away feeling like you got challenged to articulate the things you're thinking about in new ways.
Yeah.
Over time, that is super powerful for building a new kind of muscle around curiosity and networking. And that has real business impact for a bunch of reasons. And it also has social impact. So I tend to think about all of that is centered around an idea of very close parts of a network, right? You're trying to find ways to bridge people who are kind of close to each other.
Yep.
I tend to think about Connect as weaving together the corners of a network that would normally never interact, but share the network in common.
Yep.
And as a result, what you end up with over time is a much more enmeshed network.
Right.
There's technical terms for that, but the idea is that your network, the corners that aren't touching, the distance between the nodes is reduced. That's thought number one for you.
Yep.
Thought number two is that normally when we talk about networking, what we're looking to do, like I said before, is we're trying to find those direct transactional relationships, right? I know what I am looking for. And, we've talked about this before with you guys, but I think the part of the beauty of Connect is that we are trying to get people into this experimental mindset of where you don't, in a transactional interaction, you know the outcome you want. In an experimental interaction, what you're trying to do is establish you don't want to know what you want out of it.
I remember as a boy, a research physicist named Sidney Fireman saying to me, you know that in physics, it's often the physicist from outside the discipline that makes the breakthrough, because that physicist doesn't share the same entrenched assumptions and can look at things with fresh eyes. We've all experienced this. And so if I'm listening well, I'm hearing that you are connecting people in order to permit what Sidney talked about to happen. And so if we could go deeper now for a minute into these adjacencies that enable that, I just wanted folks to kind of hear the power of where you're taking us.
Right. So part of what we are testing out with the network is to see what adjacencies have meaning and which ones are further from your comfort zone and which ones are closer to your comfort zone.
Yep.
We think right now that there is a generalizable kind of model for adjacencies, but there's also the personal model for adjacencies, right? So as an example, an adjacency might simply be a city, right? And the obvious way of looking at that from a transactional mindset is to say, you're both in New York City, we should introduce you, right? That's kind of, again, how we normally think about these things. And I think that is a good, to your point about meeting Larry, I think that's awesome. You know, you and Larry are in the same city. You live half a block from each other. Incredible, right? There is another version of that, though, that piques interest. And that's to say, you are you're a children's librarian in Mid-Coast Maine. I'll use where I am, right? But you're a children's librarian at a, moderately well-off library in Mid-Coast Maine. I could introduce you to the librarian in the next town over. And, if I'm lucky, you don't know each other, and that's great. But what if is more interesting? I introduce you to that, moderately well-off librarian in rural France, right? That's suddenly kind of intriguing, right? Exactly the same set of data, right? It's just that I'm not taking it at kind of blunt transactional interaction. That is, and that's what we're trying to figure out with these adjacencies. So that is actually what I would term a near adjacency, right?
Yeah.
That we kind of know, like, geography is one that we get. But there are a whole set of other adjacencies that start to get further and further afield.
Yeah.
That what the system we have is built to experiment with. And we don't know the answer yet. But that's what's so exciting about this. This piece of culinary research was done, 20, 25 years ago. So it's a little bit older now, but the insight is awesome. And it's perfect for this. So basically what they said, these researchers set out to say, what happens when you have a monoculture culinary background and you get introduced to something new, right? So I grew up, eating Italian food. And that is what I think food is. And so the researchers found a bunch of people who had a monoculture food experience, and they introduced a second cultural food experience to them. And so they might say, like, here's Tex-Mex, you've been eating Italian all your life. And they kind of, what they expected to find when they introduced one was that people would either like it or not. And it was true. Mm-hmm. People just kind of, they either said, that's cool, or they said, oh, that was horrible, I'm going back to Italian, right? And then they introduced a third one and a fourth one. And they found that what started to happen was that people had a favorite. And so over time, that was a really interesting insight for them, right? To say, like, okay, if you introduce enough cultures to people, different things that are outside their comfort zone, they actually start to differentiate between them and have a language for comparing them. Right? Yeah. And then they have a preference. That was what they expected to find. The reason I care about the research is because what they didn't expect to find in the research that so shocked them was that when they kept going, what they started to see was that over time, people, yes, had a favorite, but what they actually really wanted was to keep getting introduced to new foods. They started to have an appetite for discovery. Yeah. And that is really powerful. Yes. So that is the thing that we are trying to do. And so, what you're trying to set up here is most of the time, what we are measuring success by is moments, right? Did this moment,
what was that word?
Moments. Did this moment in an interaction or in some engagement produce the things that I want, right? As an outcome. What we're trying to do is set up these spaces where people can practice and fail, importantly, without huge implications, so that they can get more and more comfortable figuring out how they want to engage with new environments or new people. And that turns out to be super important. And it's based on some research that I did, 10 years ago now. Alejandro, keep me honest on this, 10 years ago-ish. On empathy. and we did a bunch of research onto how you scale empathy in organizations for organizational outcomes. And leaders at the time were talking about, we need to be an empathetic organization. But aside from telling your head of HR to go hire nice people, like, nobody knew what that meant. So
Right.
asked them, what do you do? And look, the research was fascinating and the conversations were amazing. But we interviewed everybody from a prince through to religious leaders through to government officials. Like, it was cool. The big insight to come out of that research was that you cannot, just like with innovation, you cannot control empathy. You can, and so the implication of that for a leader is that what your job is to create an environment in which empathy is more likely to happen more often for a purpose. But the interesting thing for interactions when we're doing this is that you want things to have that sense of opening up storylines as opposed to closing and narrowing them down. And there are a bunch of mechanisms for doing that we bake in. But the idea is that when people start to talk to each other, you want them to constantly have that sense of like, oh, that's interesting, let's explore. Or, oh, that, I didn't think of it that way. Or, that's the story I thought I was telling about myself, but you didn't see it that way, right? You saw a different story. So how do I reconcile that in my head, right? And it's that process over and over and over and over again, not in a binge kind of way of like, I'm going to do this 12 times in 1 week, but like the drip, 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 drip every 2 weeks that matters.
So can I say one thing on that, and then I promise I'll let you get back. But the drip versus the binge.
Yeah.
We've been trained to want the binge.
Right.
The Netflix drops the whole season at one time, right? Yep. We are trained for that versus what you're saying. It's this like delayed gratification piece that seems kind of nice too.
I think that's totally true. It all, frankly, it goes back to the conference parallel, right? Like, you get to a conference and you have 40 cards, and like, there's no way you can follow up with 40 people in 1 week, before the lead goes cold, right? Like, and look, maybe you were a great conversationalist and you could totally reach out to them over the next 4 or 6 months. Great. Lots of people would love that. You should do that, by the way. If you meet 40 people at a conference and you like them all, reach out to them over 6 months. Who cares? Like, you can go back to a conversation. Yeah. My mother always had this nice line that if you piss someone off or something, it is never too late to go back to a conversation. And so I think that's true. But I also think that doesn't mean we shouldn't give ourselves space. If we can be mindful about the process, we should give ourselves space to have a practice round, to have an at-bat, screw it up somehow, come away for a couple of weeks and say like, okay, I sat on that for a week. I didn't like myself in that conversation. I'm going to try again. Try again. You get closer to it.
There are people that don't have traditional in-person close networks to rely on anyway. Like, even though as a teacher you have colleagues, you barely see them because you go into your classroom and you teach your classes all day, and you might see them at a faculty meeting a couple of times a year, but you're not put in a position to have those like big, meaningful conversations with people where you could share best practices or do something like that because of the way your job is constructed, which is a really interesting piece. And the other thing I wanted to make a connection to is Michael Schumann's work in the Main Street Journal talking about these local economies. When you have these local resilient economies, to go back to your local librarian or your local independent school teacher, if they can learn best practices through these digital tools and bring them back, there's no competition with the rural school teacher in France and the independent teacher in Maine. They're not competing for the same customers. They can both implement practices to get better at what they do.
Just the fact that the person in Maine is talking to the person in Arkansas, is talking to the person in Wyoming, is talking to the person in Washington, right? Just the fact that they are talking to those people bridges real divides and starts to create relationships so that people start to humanize each other, right? On both sides of the aisle, that's a real problem.
For sure.
And so that to me is where this becomes a really interesting, a powerful thing, that it is not just outputs, outcomes, income, input measurement of the things that you expect. It is the networks of relationships that will carry weight and have value in terms of efficiency later, in terms of the creativity and innovation potential of that network, right? Wouldn't it be awesome if every small town in Canada, once they started to know each other because they were talking about this water main project, they actually you got the person out in PEI talking to the person in, in northern Alberta who was like, I really, I don't understand why there's all this conflict between Alberta and the federal government. I'm going to just call John, and have like, maybe he'll tell me what he's thinking. And I might not agree with him, but like, I know John enough and I respect him because we worked on the infrastructure project together. Like, he gave me good insight. I respect him enough to, like, I'm not going to downplay what he clearly thinks is interesting. Look, maybe that won't happen every single time. I'm not the kind of total, naive optimist that way. But if you do 20, 40, 70 matches, you will start to see some of those people as humans.
So this is a really interesting piece because there's some research that was done probably 20 years ago in Cyprus. And Cyprus is half Greek and half Turkish, and they traditionally do not get along. But there was a project, like an initiative to put people on both sides of the border on solving these common problems in an attempt to weaken the sort of polarization of that island and help them work together more effectively. And they found that was a really important piece of it, which is having, a Greek person from Cyprus and a Turkish person from Cyprus work together on a project. They began to see the people on the other side of that line as people and not sort of faceless other. And that changed how they were able to work together.
The early internet, there was this idea of a global bazaar. And there was this hope, this optimism that we'd all be connected. Say that again.
Bazaar, not bizarre.
Right. Now it's a little bit of both, right?
That's bizarre. No, it was bizarre with an A, where we would be connecting with each other, creating together, having access to information and tools we've never had. And for many young people I work with today, there's this sense that is either a broken promise or it was actually an illusion from the beginning, because the experience of the internet can be often being exploited, being constantly approached transactionally, and having division be expanded actually through digital forums. But what if it's less of a broken promise than something we're just beginning to learn how to do? What if what we're talking about here is actually that we need to figure out how to use this unprecedented connectivity in the most powerful ways? And what if what Connect Networks is doing is figuring out how to create that wrinkle in time and create that surprise in the interaction? And what if the work that Mim and I write about in terms of opening up Kitty Hawk moments, and actually the research we present on how that is actually very possible if we do these things, is something we're just learning to do? And what if the work that the Democratizing Innovation Institute does to open up the experimental mindset for people that up until then had not had the opportunity to experiment is something that could, as we say at the beginning of every episode, become normal? What if the interactions that we see every week on Rebel Base, where people are collaborating with folks they never would have worked with in a structured way that they say makes them able to bridge diversity and be critical and present new ideas and replace the way things are? What if we actually, it's not that the digital age failed us, it's that we need to learn to use it?
We need forums that have purpose and space in order to have enough space to actually discover each other as humans, and a language that we are comfortable with that does that. And so the example,
and maybe a structure, I've heard you saying, But we need to
Absolutely.
structure the forum to open space, which sounds like
Totally.
a contradiction. Go on.
We didn't ever get to the other steps in the process of connect. But the next step after you talk to people is that you have the option of actually giving feedback. You don't have to, but we do it in a kind of interesting way. And the idea is that we ask you to reflect on the conversation. We don't have to get into the process that we use to do it, but the point is that you speak to the system and you tell it kind of what you're thinking, and over time, the system has a bunch of insight into what you liked and didn't like and what you took away from it. It's kind of like, it's not journaling, but it's close, right? And so it's really light touch, again, humanistic minimalism. But the idea is that we get good insight into what surprised you, what were the most useful outcomes, what were the things that you felt like you learned from it, all that kind of stuff, right? Like, good questions. Fast feedback process, super easy for the user. The normal process for a tech company to go through is to say, hey, Alejandro, congratulations on having done 20 matches, right? Did you know you are now an expert networker? Did you know that other expert networkers, the people who've done 50 matches in our network, they do the following 5 things in their conversations? You should try those, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've all gotten that email, right? And maybe one of those 5 feels real, right? And you're like, okay, I guess I can, that's good. I can try that. And then you're left to kind of be like, oh shit, now I have to figure out my next conversation. Like, how do I integrate that? Like, oh, I'm supposed to do this, right? Oh, I'm supposed to remember to do that, right? And so it feels kind of awkward and artificial, right? So we've all gone through that process. That is what the systems we have gotten used to developing as a system that tells us how to improve. There's 2 problems with that. One is that it is not in our voice. It is not recognizable with our voice. The second thing is that it normalizes behaviors. And what I'm really interested in doing is not getting you, Mim, and you, Alejandro, to be the same person in networking. I'm interested in getting you, Mim, to be awesome, Mim, and Alejandro getting you to be awesome, Alejandro. Right?
Can't we have a different adjective, each of us? No, I'm just messing with you. But, go on. Please continue.
So what we're doing that's different. So that's the kind of practical thing that, at a practical instance that we've all experienced. Yep. That's how we know that's what a feedback process looks like, right? I'm saying no, that's not necessarily what a feedback process looks like. What we're doing is saying, this is the note you will get. It says, Mim, congratulations on doing 20 matches. That's awesome. We are so glad you've been enjoying them, and you've been getting some really interesting insights from them. Did you know that when you start your conversations with a question instead of telling the person about yourself, you rate those conversations 25% higher? Did you know that when you ask a probing question after you ask your first one, that those conversations go 20 minutes longer on average than the ones where you don't?
Mm-hmm.
And so the thing we're trying to do is we are taking your feedback, because 20 matches in, you're not going to remember the ones at the beginning. That's where the system is useful. Right. But what's different is that we're playing it back to you in language that is yours, not the system's. And this is a super, again, humanistic minimalism, right? This is a super important point in terms of behavior change, not at the scale of just you and me, but at the scale of tens of thousands of people. They will become more and more themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So what I love about this, to make a shameless plug for our book, is that in the book we talk a lot about the how top-down models do not fit local context. Your point about like the people who make the 50 matches do these things, go do these things. Like that's what I was hearing as you were talking about this, versus, hey, what's the personalized feedback I need so that I can make a better connection? This like local context being front and center and taking sort of pride of place in how people incorporate feedback to make their participation in the network work for them.
And it also could point to something we won't be able to get into in this conversation, which is how we can guide large language models to do less of telling us what we want to hear and more of listening to us and using the incredible synthesis at their disposal to take us in unexpected directions. There's a quotation from James G. Marsh, an organizational theorist, that is often in my mind, where he says, homogeneous groups become progressively better at doing what they already know how to do, but progressively worse at investigating alternatives. What you're making me think is that it's beyond the homogeneity of the group. It's that discussing what I expect and pursuing what I want deprives me, makes my own experience homogeneous with itself, right? And I leave the explore mode that we've talked about in previous conversations in the psychology sense, and I start getting to exploit mode. And I feel as if what you're doing is finding behavioral ways to very gently nudge us back into an exploration. I am so grateful to you, David, for the way you're combining thinking and experimenting with tools that make these things possible and bring them to new populations. To me, it's this incredibly needed thing. I hope we can have another conversation with you, because I feel as if there are so many strands that we've just begun to talk about. But for the moment, I just want to appreciate what you're doing, David, with Connect Networks and the experiment with which you're on, which I'm hoping you'll keep us posted on. Say it again, David.
I would love that.
It'd be great if you were like, no, I made my points. We're good. This is all I got.
But that's enough.
Or
that's right. I got my talking points out there. It took forever with y'all interrupting me with interesting questions. And actually, on that,
too soon.
I'm going to do something that I've never done in one of these podcasts. But there is, don't worry, it's very short. There was a poem that I published in a journal called Street Notes around the time that David and I first knew each other. Since Mim and I met in the nursery together, it was after we had met. And it was about an all-night falafel shop. And it said that the best thing about my city is that you can talk to people you don't know as if they were your mother. And it goes on and says, and you can see why you made me think about this, I love meeting people this way because their openness is a link in a chain. One link doesn't have to understand the other. It need know nothing of it, though together they could not have failed to be, because we're making a chain together. I don't know why I prize the indeterminate connections above all others, but I seek out connections made with people by surprise. And it goes on, but I just wanted to read that as kind of a thank you, because that thing that I found in an all-night falafel shop during my misspent youth, I feel as if you're bringing to places where we haven't had it before, or where we've lost it with people we haven't had it with before. So thank you so much.
That's a beautiful note to end on. I think that's a great, and thank you for sharing the poem. Awesome.